Perhaps you have a vintage kit with raised panel lines and you want it to look better. Or there are a few misplaced panel lines on your kit. Or a couple of access panels that are missing. Then this video is for you. Because here I'm going to show you how I deal with all the issues regarding the panel lines. Let's go over the tools that we're going to use. Everything that I'm going to show you can be done using a simple sewing needle in a pin vise. However, the dedicated tools have their advantages. So here we have a MRP Mr. Scriber narrow with just 0.16mm width. I'll call it a claw type scriber because it looks like eagle's claw. Next comes the Tamiya fine craft saws, which are very thin and just as useful. Then some sort of a needle or other pointed sharp device will come handy. Fine line vinyl masking tape is very good at leading the scribing tools. Some scribing templates, which are incredibly valuable part of the toolbox. Some sheet plastic and some sanding materials. Mr. Cementes is the best solution for the application I'm going to show you. Plastic glue can always come handy. At some point we will use CA glue, believe it or not. A pencil and a divider with a graphite tip are essential. Some brushes, an airbrush and compressor for cleanup. And finally, a flexible metal ruler, also to guide the scribing tools. Now let's start with something simple. Whenever two fuselage halves get joined and the seam lines get taken care of, chances are some panel lines will get lost. The best way is to avoid this by making the panel line deeper before we get to dealing with the seam. A few passes with 18 saw will ensure that you will still have a panel line after sanding. Then, if necessary, you can run the claw type scriber once or twice. If the damage is done and the distance between the existing portions of the panel line is significant, some vinyl tape will help us establish a guide for the scriber to follow. After a few passes, a cleanup and some Mr. Cementes, we have a nice panel line. If the distance between the panel lines that survived is small enough, all we need are a couple of passes with the thin saw and then the cleanup procedure. Now let's see how we can deal with another post-assembly issue. In recent years, manufacturers are trying to place the joints on existing panel lines. This is good, but creates an issue with the quality of the panel line. Here, the real solution is to make sure that the parts fit as close to perfect as possible and eliminate any possible gaps. Then we glue the parts together using plastic cement. We need to let it cure so we can comfortably scribe over the joint. 24 hours should be sufficient. While gluing, we have to avoid melted plastic oozing out of the joint. This will make our job much more difficult. After this, we can make the new panel line by running the claw type scriber in the joint. Now let's see what issues we can encounter even if our kit has recessed panel lines. Oftentimes, recessed panel lines can be too shallow and can disappear under a few coats of paint. What we can do to improve the looks is quite simple. Make a few passes with the scriber and the panel lines instantly get better, but not so fast. There are a few things that we need to take into consideration. Take the scale into account. While a 1 to 1/44 scale airplane needs just one light pass, the 1 to 24 car can take several. The more passes you do, the wider the panel line gets. Also, sometimes the panel lines are not properly molded into the plastic, and their depth vary along their length. This is highly likely to cause your scriber to jump out of the panel line. Mostly shallow spots can be found on top of arching surfaces, but not only there, so make sure you inspect your panel lines. When you find issues, you can correct them with Tamiya's thin saw type scriber or similar tool. After the panel line is done, it needs to be cleaned up from debris. A brush or compressed air can be used to clean up the sanding dust. Then a restraint application of Mr. Cementes to soften the edges and melt down any leftover debris. And look at the difference. On the left we have nice deep and sharp panel line, whereas on the right we can clearly see the bottom. Or here, where we have made just one pass with the scriber. Before we get to the most important part of this tutorial, let me introduce you the sponsor of today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for you to choose from and develop new skills, hone your existing arsenal, or just explore for something new to capture your imagination. On the platform you can find everything from photography and web development to business analytics and productivity classes. My personal favorite so far is the fundamentals of DSLR photography by Justin Bridges. The way that he explains how to balance the exposure triangle is super easy to understand, and I'm sure this class will help me to improve the quality of my scale modeling photography. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, meaning that there are no ads and they are always launching new premium classes. The first 1000 people to use the link in the description will get a 1 month free trial of Skillshare so you can explore your creativity. Now let's get back to the tutorial. 3 ways to approach raised panel lines. If yours are high enough, you can use them as guides for your scriber. Nice and simple. Make a few passes along the existing panel line, then sand everything smooth, clean up the debris, and you are golden. However, sometimes this can play bad games with you. Just like here, where the raised panel line was not consistent enough to its entire length. So we go to option number 2. Using the pointed scriber, make tiny holes, which will mark the position of the panel line. Wipe everything away with your sanding device, then the sanding dust will fill the indentations you made, which will serve as a clear indication for where your tape should go. Mark the end of the panel line if it is internal for the detail surface, and carefully scribe the new panel line. Then sand, clean, and your panel line is ready. Our third option is to use scale drawings and create the panel lines from scratch. If you have the drawings in your scale, that's perfect. If not, I have a very stupid but simple method of scaling drawings I find on the interwebs. Get the drawing in Photoshop or similar software, measure the distance between 2 points on the model, then create a rectangle with the same length as the measurement and resize the drawing to fit the rectangle. Just make sure you keep the proportions of the image when resizing. Probably there are more sophisticated methods, but this one works. Now we can remove the raised panel lines. Then we need to establish a couple of baselines, which are easy to reference onto the part. For me, the easiest way to transfer panel lines from the drawing to the model is using a divider with graphite tip. For longer lines, I use flexible steel ruler as it is much faster to position than the tape, and if held properly in position, it's not going to move or deform. All we need to do now is a few light passes with the scriber. In the case of this 1:7 scale kit, I am making 2 passes. Now that we have the base lines, we can mark the intersections with their perpendicular panel lines, transferred from the drawings. Next, we scribe the panel line. After that, it's rinse and repeat until all is done. One thing to note here, always make the measurements from a baseline and not from one line to the next one. This way you avoid stacking errors. Small errors may go unnoticed, but if you stack a few, then the last line can get way out of alignment. Next, we can sand the surface smooth and then blow out the sanding dust from the panel lines. Alternatively, soapy water and brush work well too. Small amount of Mr. Cement S is going to take care of any leftover debris. And it is all done. But what about those access panels? Besides the case of re-scribing a complete kit, I'm sure that you have models that are missing some of those all-important hatches and access panel details. Fortunately, there is a huge choice of templates with all kinds of shapes and sizes. There are a couple of very important things to do here. First is to make sure that our template is positioned as close to perfect as possible. And the second is to make sure that the template is firmly secured in position and conforming with the surface of the model. Here is where the pointed scriber and needle excel. After a couple of laps resting our tool on the template, we can remove it and then sand and clean up the area. It is best to avoid sanding over other panel lines to avoid unnecessary cleanup. After a little bit of Mr. Cement test, we have wonderful access panels. But what if we cannot fit the template for some reason? Don't worry, here is the solution. Using a thin sheet of plastic and a metal template, we are going to make our own guide, with the help of the pointed scriber and possibly a scalpel blade. The goal here is to go through the plastic and get a detail that has the same shape and size as the outline of our access panel. Then, using a small quantity of CA glue, we are going to secure our guide in place. Then it is a matter of carefully scribing around the plastic piece. Once we are done, we can remove the guide and sand the surface smooth. And this is how we overcame one more problem. But wait, what about fixing scribing mishaps, you might ask? I got you covered, fellas. To fix errors or fill unwanted panel lines, first we need to know whether we are going to scribe over them. If not, it's easy, just use your favorite filler. For this job I use Mr. Surfacer 500, as I can apply it with fine brush, which allows me to put the filler in very confined surfaces. After application, the surfacer needs to dry for a while and then it can be sanded smooth. If we need to scribe over the area, then I suggest using plastic glue, which is sprue melted in plastic cement. This filler will have the closest properties to the plastic of the model. One disadvantage is that it needs a lot of time to cure properly. In most cases it can be sanded after 24 hours, but to scribe over it at least 3 days must pass. You can check the curing condition by pressing a fingernail against the filler. If you can leave an indentation, then the filler is not ready to be sanded. Now that we have this beautiful finish, it is the perfect moment to apply the rivet details. How to do that you can learn with my riveting tutorial. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy modeling, fellas!